In this video, we'll learn about John Adams and the Alien and Sedition Acts and the struggle between the newly emerging political parties in the United States. Exulting Federalists had meanwhile capitalized on the anti-French frenzy to drive through Congress two laws designed to muffle or minimize their Jeffersonian foes. The first of these oppressive laws was aimed at supposedly pro-Jeffersonian aliens. Most European immigrants, lacking wealth, were scorned by the aristocratic Federalist Party, but were welcomed as voters to the more democratic Jeffersonians. The Federalist Congress erected a barrier by raising the residency requirements for aliens who desired to become citizens from 5 years to 14. The new law violated the traditional American policy of hospitality and assimilation. Two additional alien laws struck heavily at undesirable immigrants, saying the president has the power to deport dangerous foreigners in time of peace and to deport or imprison them in time of hostilities, arbitrarily granting executive power. This is the Alien Act. The Lockjaw Sedition Act, the last measure of the Federalist clampdown, was a direct slap at two priceless freedoms guaranteed in the Constitution by the Bill of Rights, the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press, both guaranteed in the First Amendment. This law provided that anyone who impeded the policies of the government or falsely defamed its officials would be liable to a heavy fine or imprisonment. Many outspoken Jeffersonian editors of newspapers were indicted under the Sedition Act, and 10 were brought to trial. All of them were convicted, often by packed juries and prejudiced judges. Some of the victims were harmless partisans who should have been spared the notoriety of martyrdom, and among them was Congressman Matthew Lyon, who had earlier gained fame by spitting in the face of a Federalist. He was sentenced to 4 months in jail for writing of President Adams' thirst for pomp, adulation, and avarice. These together form the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Sedition Act seemed to be in conflict with the Constitution and the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court, dominated by the Federalists, was in no mind to declare the law unconstitutional. This attempt by the Federalists to crush free speech and silence the opposition party, which is the Democratic Republicans, high-handed as it was, made many people convert and join the Jeffersonians. Yet the Alien and Sedition Acts, despite the outcries from the Jeffersonians, commanded widespread popular support. Anti-French hysteria played directly into the hands of these witch-hunting conservatives. In the congressional elections of 1798 and 1799, the Federalists, actually riding a wave of popularity, scored one of their most sweeping victories. Resentful Jeffersonians naturally refused to take the Alien and Sedition laws lying down. Jefferson feared that the Federalists, if they managed to choke free speech and free press, then they would wipe out other of the precious constitutional guarantees guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, and so his own political party might be stamped out of existence. Fearing prosecution for sedition, Jefferson secretly penned a series of resolutions, which the Kentucky legislature approved in 1798 and 1799. His friend and fellow Virginian James Madison drafted a similar but less extreme statement of the resolutions, which was adopted by the legislature of Virginia in 1798. Both Jefferson and Madison stressed in their Virginia and Kentucky resolutions the compact theory. This concept meant that the 13 sovereign states, in creating the federal government, had entered into a compact or a contract regarding its jurisdiction, and the national government was consequently the agent or creation of the states, so it should be able to states should be able to decide whether a law that the federal government passes is constitutional or not. Invoking this logic, Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions concluded that the federal regime had exceeded its constitutional power and that with regard to the Alien and Sedition Acts, nullification, which was a refusal to accept them, was the way to handle it. No other state legislatures, despite Jefferson's hopes, fell into line, and some flatly refused to endorse the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Others added them and rang out their condemnations as well. Federalists argued that the people, not the states, had made the supreme original compact, and it was up to the Supreme Court to nullify unconstitutional legislation. This practice, although not authorized by the Constitution, was finally adopted by South Carolina in 1803. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were a brilliant formulation of the extreme states' rights view regarding the Union, and indeed more sweeping in their implications than intended. They were later used by Southerners to support nullification and ultimately secession as we near the Civil War. Their resolutions were basically campaign documents designed to crystallize opposition to the Federalist Party and unseat it in the upcoming presidential election of 1800. So the doctrines presented in the Virginia and Kentucky Resolution said that states have fundamental rights that the federal government cannot supersede. The U.S. Constitution exists as a compact between the federal and state governments, and that states have the right to nullify federal laws that they judge unconstitutional. At the presidential contest of 1800, the differences between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans continued to increase and be sharply etched. Most Federalists of the pre-Constitution period were largely welded by Hamilton into an effective group by 1793, openly advocated for rule by the best people. Those who own the country ought to govern it. Hamiltonians distrusted full-blown democracy as the foundation of all mischief and feared the swayability of the untutored common folk of America. Hamiltonian Federalists also advocated a strong central government with the power to crush democratic excesses like Shays' Rebellion, protect the lives and estates of the wealthy, and subordinate the sovereignty of loving states by the United States. They believed that the government should support private enterprise, and that this attitude came naturally to the merchants, manufacturers, and shippers along the eastern seaboard, and they made up the majority of the Federalist supporters. The two political parties can be compared here in this table. Pause the video and read through the comparison for further details. Federalists were also pro-British in foreign affairs. Some of them still harbored mildly loyalist sentiments from pre-revolutionary days, but all of them recognized that foreign trade, especially with Great Britain, was a key cog in Hamilton's fiscal machinery. Leading the anti-Federalists, who eventually became known as the Democratic Republicans, was Thomas Jefferson. And although he was unable to deliver a rabble-rousing speech, he became a master political organizer through his ability to lead the people. His strongest appeal was to the middle class and the underprivileged, the common people. Liberal-thinking Jefferson, with his aristocratic head set on a farmer's frame, was a bundle of inconsistencies. A so-called traitor to the upper class, Jefferson cherished uncommon sympathy for the common people, the downtrodden, the oppressed, and the persecuted. Jeffersonian Republicans demanded a weak central regime. The best government was one that was governed the least. The bulk of the power should be retained by the states. From the states, the people, in more intimate contact with local affairs, could keep a more vigilant eye on their public, and central authority was to be kept at a minimum through strict interpretation of the Constitution, and the national debt was to be paid off. Jeffersonian Republicans insisted that there should be no special privileges for special classes, particularly manufacturers, and they favored agriculture as the economic base for the United States. Above all, Jefferson advocated the rule of the people. He favored government for the people, but not by all the people, only by those men who were literate enough to be involved. Universal education would have to precede universal suffrage, and the ignorant were thus incapable of self-government, although Jefferson had faith in the masses and collective wisdom. Landless among American citizens threatened popular democracy like illiteracy. He feared that the propertyless dependents would become political pawns in the hands of their land-owning superiors. So how could the emergence of a landless class of voters be avoided? The answer, in part, was by slavery, a system of black labor, slave labor in the South, that ensured that white yeoman farmers could remain independent landowners. Without slavery, poor whites would have to provide the cheap labor so necessary for the cultivation of tobacco and rice, and their low wages would preclude them ever owning property. Jefferson thus tortuously reconciled slaveholding with democracy. Jefferson's confidence that white free men could become responsible and knowledgeable citizens was open-minded. He championed their freedom of speech, for without freedom of speech, the misdeeds of tyranny could not be exposed. Jeffersonian Republicans were basically pro-French. They earnestly believed that it was America's advantage to support the liberal ideals of the French Revolution. So as the young republic's first full decade of nationhood comes to a close, the founders' hopes seemed already imperiled. Conflicts over domestic policies and foreign policy undermined the unity of the Revolutionary era and called into question the new country's viability. As the presidential election of the 1800 approached, the danger loomed that the fragile and battered American ship of state would founder on the rocks of controversy. And we'll discuss the presidential election of 1800 in more depth in class.